Okay, it looks like we're starting to tail off. Hi, everybody. My name is Patrick Pusher. We'll do introductions in just a moment, but first and foremost, I want to thank you for spending about the next 60 minutes of your time with us. We have a really a packed session. We've got a little bit of slideware. We've got some examples. We've got a great, well-experienced guest with an awesome perspective. So let's get into it. So before we introduce our guest, I want to set the stage with a simple question, really. If you had only a few days, and of course we have longer than that, but we know we don't have all the time in the world to solve the most critical appSec risks, how would you do that? Where would you begin? We're going to talk a little bit about how many tools and approaches are used in appSec, right? And how poorly they are integrated. And if you had to visit each one of those pillars, and if you had to determine your overall risk, and you had only a short period of time to do that, how would you do that? What methodology would you use? What tools would you use? And how would you aggregate all that information for a sense of risk? We're going to answer that question by the end of the webinar, but it's a good stage setter for sure. So before we begin, my name is Patrick Pusher. I lead product marketing efforts here at Backslash Security. My background's really focused around cloud native security in a lot of forms. I was fortunate enough to be part of the birth of the cloud security posture manager revolution, if you will, and part of the second generation where, we took a lot of lessons learned from, showing the user a lot of data, but maybe a little bit too much data, right? And in the second generation of the CSPM, we learned a lot of those lessons, and we did a much better job. We're going to carry some of that experience over to our session today. But you don't want to hear me talk about this. You really don't. You want to hear somebody experienced both from a security and a developer's perspective. And that's exactly who we have for you today. Trupti, maybe you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you, Patrick. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for participating and attending in this webinar today. My name is Trupti. I am a seasoned product security professional. It's been 18 years. I am doing application security, product security, cryptography, and you name it, in small, medium, and large size company. I started my career as a mobile game developer and then made my journey through security. So I exactly know the pain points development team face when security engineering teams presents avalanche of alerts, security findings from gazillion scanners and whatnot. And today I'm really excited to share this platform with Patrick to bring lessons learned from 18 years around how we can reduce that avalanche of vulnerabilities, how we can consider reachability and VEX to drive efficient prioritization.
Absolutely. And with that kind of background, Trupti, I can't think of anyone better to lead us through the subject. So let's talk a little bit what we're going to cover today. As I promised, we're going to take a little bit of a step back, look at some lessons learned. We're going to define a few terms that we'll use throughout the rest of this presentation, basic ones, but also some that are newer. This idea of this emerging category of appSec approach called ASPM and what that means, and this abundance of what we're calling signals. And then we'll talk specifically about two of the most powerful signals, reachability and VEX, and they're strongly related. And then we'll look at some examples. But just as a part of some housekeeping, please do, if you've got questions, things that come to mind as we're presenting, please don't risk missing them or forgetting them. Put them in the Q&A section, and Trupti and I will do our best at the end to reserve a few minutes to go over those. Okay, so back to basics. Let's talk first about two terms we'll use throughout the rest of this presentation. First is when we talk about vulnerabilities, right? What are we referring to? We're talking about a weakness in code, in design, and architecture. But this is probably the most important differentiator between vulnerability and risk, and that is a vulnerability could be exploitable, or maybe it isn't. And in fact, if I had to choose one sentence to encapsulate what we're talking about today, it's that one, right? I have something wrong. Is it exploitable or is it not? A lot of tools and a lot of approaches to this problem will tell me I have something wrong. Far fewer will tell me, is that something wrong exploitable? Because that is it's a difficult thing to understand, right? We've got, we'll talk about this in a minute, but we've got infrastructure components, we've got code level components. Determining if something is exploitable isn't easy. And so the easiest thing is say, hey, I see something that doesn't look right. Determining if somebody can actually, a threat actor can actually get to it is a very different thing. And so a vulnerability is a type of risk, right? A risk is something quite different. A risk is always exploitable. So once a vulnerability, becomes exploited, once we see an attack path, a way to get to it, it's a risk. But until that, it isn't. And there's a big differentiator there. And I think it's important to level set there, Trupti.
You're absolutely right, Patrick. And I would like to give our audience a simple analogy from healthcare.
Please.
A weakness in code or insecure coding pattern, it may or may not be exploitable. So think of this as a vitamin deficiency. Can a vitamin deficiency result in a disease disorder? Maybe, may not be. It all depends on, what are the threat agent.
Sure.
If there is an active infection going on in your body, then you may develop fever, or, your vitamin deficiency make things worse. This is exactly the same concept with vulnerabilities versus risk. A vulnerability is just a flaw. It may or may not be actual risk. So when security engineering teams plainly share gazillion results of scanners to dev team, they get overwhelmed. And it is their duty to, come together, develop that context, and try to look at the vulnerability through the lenses of risk. What's the overall security risk? Do we have a clearly defined threat agent here? And if the threat agent is able to exploit something, what's the overall impact? And then we can decide, prioritization related to remediation effort.
So true. I mean, risk becomes mandatory when the volume exceeds, 10 observations or 10 alerts, right? If we have a handful of things, of course, we can somewhat, even then, I guess, if they're complex enough, it could be difficult. But, when we talk about the volume of application, the kind of alerts that an application author or an application security team will have to work together to resolve, right? There's a mountain of them, especially when we have tools that, look at a very well-defined condition, have a check mark, and then, won't really help us with any context where the problem is, how deep is the problem, how do I fix the problem, right? So that's so true. And while we're defining terms, let's talk about signals. That's another term that probably in application security we haven't used quite, in my opinion, enough, right? And I think it's because of this approach, as you mentioned, Trupti, this, we know it's more than one domain in appSec. We've got different ways to look at the code. We have SAST methods, we have SCA methods. We look through secrets in our code. I think we're starting to get better about understanding that the app boundary isn't just the code, right? It's the infrastructure around the application. That's not just the CSPM's job anymore, right? We're thinking in those kinds of terms. And all that means, if we're trying to think about a unified way to think about this, many signals from the code, signals from infrastructure as code, signals from infrastructure, right? So that's what we're talking about, is how do we think about these multiple signals, combine them in an intelligent way for a better idea of our quote unquote security situational awareness.
Yes, unfortunately, in today's modern world, we have so many complex enterprise application. 10, 15 years back, we used to have this giant monoliths where the architecture was slightly simpler because of the tight coupling. But if you look at modern enterprise applications, they're full of microservices. So when security engineering teams literally use 20, 25 different scanners, including, as you say, SAST, software composition analysis, CSPM, CWS, and whatnot, and present those overwhelming number of signals or alerts or findings to engineering team, it becomes extremely hard. So before we go to engineering team, as you said, Patrick, it's very important to correlate these signals, sit down with them, and try to understand which one of this is important, which one of this make real sense. Not all alerts have the same severity. Yes.
Absolutely, severity is there for a reason, and I alluded to it earlier, but we've learned this lesson in other domains before, and this is one that I'm really familiar with, but certainly not the only one. And that is, our first approach at solving a problem often is, let's just think about how much information we can give to the end user, and that's what a CSPM did, right? You've got all this cloud configuration. We know that it can easily get changed, much like code can easily get changed. So we need to have eyes on that. We need some drift. Some sort of drift view from, this is the way I want my controls. When they change, I need to know. But there's an overwhelming number. So the first generation of CSPM did exactly what we asked it to, and it gave us any idea when anything changed. But what they're effectively telling us is that you have a vulnerability here. What they weren't telling us is you have a risk here, because we had no idea if they're exploitable. The second generation of CSPM was a big leap towards that. Right now, and we have certain sort of companies we can talk about that do this, or technologies, but it's becoming more and more commonplace where we see something severe. Maybe we find malware in a workload, and then we trace it back and we say, can we actually exploit that? Because guess what? I found malware in 500 workloads because I'm an enterprise. So it's bad in 500 cases, but where is it the worst? Right? That's what a first generation CSPM wouldn't tell me. But thanks to the incorporation of many more signals and an algorithm to understand them and weigh them, and that was obviously an evolving kind of beast that had to grow and mature, but we're there now, right? And thanks to that incorporation of signals, we have a much more high fidelity idea of risk in that cloud security posture manager. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that we're now starting to hear more about this category of application security posture management.
Mm-hmm. Patrick, we can see the similar trend with application security as well. Like 10, 15 years back when cloud was still rising up, all these different application security tools such as static code analysis, software composition analysis, dynamic application security testing, they would report back the findings to us in siloed. An application security engineer would sit down and manually take all the different findings and try to map these with different assets and plot the attack path. So good to see this type of natural evolution already happen in the cloud security world, but application security will still get there.
Yeah, and I think it seems like it's the impetus or the driving factor towards this emerging. Gartner has a emerging category. I say emerging because I think there's 2 publications on it so far. But in that amount of information, they're clearly answering a question of how do we get away from that siloed approach? We need all that intelligence. None of those silos are a bad idea or ineffective, but how do we attach the intelligence from each one, take the onus away from you, Trupti, to do that, to effectively threat model manually? How do we do that with many signals, with as much intelligence as we can think of across the life cycle of an app? And that's we can use more terms, but that's really what the definition of ASPM is shaping up to be. And I think it answers a lot of those challenges you just talked about.
You're absolutely right. ASPM is still a very emerging concept. If you ask me 5 years back what ASPM is, I would say, I don't know.
Of course.
We take a look at all the results from these scanners, and then we do manual threat modeling, manual design architecture review, manual penetration test, and sit down with engineering team, look at all the results and try to see which ones are exploitable and which ones are not. Right? But with the emergence of ASPM, it really going to make application security and software security engineers' job easy, because they are going to get one-stop shop to see the assets and attack paths and how these different alerts or signals are relevant with respect to data and assets. So I'm really excited about this new emerging trend and can't wait to learn more.
Listen, as an infrastructure guy, I'm excited too. And that's, it's interesting because even us infrastructure folks have had to become developers in so many ways, right? And not just in the infrastructure as code kind of simple way, but the ways we program infrastructure, the way we secure infrastructure. I mean, often doesn't involve a UI anymore. It involves API calls. It involves code. And so really all of us have been pushed into the world of code. And so I think it's really easy to understand, geez, I import a library, I use a function from an open source library. Should I have done that? Am I at risk? Have I done anything wrong? And then amplify that by kind of that enterprise position, like you say. It was one thing when applications were developed in that big monolithic chunk and the infrastructure never changed. Maybe the app itself got an update, once a year. To measure risk there, I'm not saying would lack challenge, but it'd be a very different thing, right? So now we've got apps that control infrastructure themselves based on demand, right? So it's almost complete reversed. And so yeah, we look to, in an automated way, if we can, incorporate as many signals as we can. And we're going to talk about 2 such signals. Maybe the most important, arguably, maybe not. I think for appSec, maybe the most important is the breadth of all of these together, since we have been so siloed for so long. But certainly reachability and VEX as a kind of a related concept give us the ability to measure risk instead of vulnerabilities, right? Whereas so many of our approaches to this problem really have been, geez, you imported a library, that's enough. That's enough to trip a high severity alert. And it should be enough to tell me something, but it maybe not necessarily a high severity alert, especially in the context of everything else I have to deal with. So let's talk about that. So let's talk about reachability. As we talked about, I guess reachability, like ASPM, it's not quite as new as that, but it's still an emerging term. When we talk about it, certainly in the development context, even in most security contexts, it has to do with code. But when you think about the overall idea of reachability, it's all the way from outside in. Is there an attack path? And then from the code level, when I think about, does my code reach into any areas that are vulnerable, that have risk, right? Just the importation of a library really isn't enough for me to say my application has now a ton of risk associated with it, because I think that library you imported is vulnerable, right? That's a calculation that if we're talking about first versus second generation of tools, that the first generation of appSec tools made, and now we're looking to be quite a bit more smart than that, saying not only if I use an open source library or package, do I have any risk? What if that package imports another? I have no visibility into that as a developer. What if that happens? Does it have any risk, right? Just because I see an import, it does a pattern match to something that looks vulnerable. It's simply not enough in the sea of alerts anymore. So that's what we're talking about when you talk about reachability at the code level.
In fact, when the first generation software composition analysis tools came out, what they would do, Patrick, is simply look for the CVEs and match the library versions and SHA checksums, and that's it. And this was not at all useful. Like as an application security engineer, I would sit down with so many vulnerabilities, and what I found is only 5% of them were exploitable. And back then, 10, 15 years back, I would do all the reachability analysis manually by first doing, contextual source code search for the vulnerable function and parameter. And then I would see, as an external attacker, let's say a state actor who doesn't have any access to that enterprise application, can I get in somehow? Or as a malicious insider, what's my path to get to that asset or crown jewel? Is it even possible, or there are other security controls? So I genuinely believe, it's good to have vulnerability information, exploitability information, but it's the reachability that makes everybody's life super easy once they figure out. How to figure out, that's super hard. But let's talk about that.
It sounds like you were the first manual ASPM, you and your team, right? Looking at, well, because I mean, that's the gap. We have tools to look at sort of areas of concern, but when we look at, and I used that term earlier, that security situational awareness, but how do I know what my biggest risks always are if I have 5 different tool sets and 5 different approaches all measuring risk in their own way, right? It's so hard, right? And so this is the reachability is sort of one of these signals. And again, it has to be used in a platform that looks at much more than reachability. But if it is, it's still one of the, I think, the primary ways we reduce that load on application security professionals, right? We'll go through some examples so we make it crystal clear, but that's really, really, really important. And let's talk about the 3 key. There's many more advantages, I think, of reachability, and let's talk about automated reachability for a moment, because I mean, you had mentioned you've done this in the past. I'll ask you a really blunt question. For an enterprise that develops even just a handful of applications on cloud native infrastructure, is it possible to do this by hand?
It's very, very difficult to get hold of the complete architecture assets, and it would take me days, if not weeks, just to plot that reachability path.
Yeah, I mean, so that seems like that's the case to me, right? But I'm glad to hear you say it, because the idea is, how do we incorporate all these signals in an intelligent algorithm, reachability being the key. Reachability helps us prioritize with precision, as we talked about, right? We'll see lots of vulnerabilities in our application estate. Which ones are truly risks? It'll help us do that. It'll also help us focus on fixing those biggest risks. I mean, that's that's what all that manual effort is for. Where are my largest risks, right? If we can think about a multi-signal approach with reachability kind of leading the way, we'll have lots of vulnerabilities. The list is overwhelming. You know, like you talked about, the first stab at the second generation CSPM looking further into your content included a little bit of workload content and included finding open source libraries. And it included, and I'm not bashing it because it was a good first step, but a really dumb CVSS lookup. And that was it, right? So you'd find libraries, you'd find the associated scores, but in terms of knowing any more about it, knowing maybe what was leveraging those libraries, right? It was a good first attempt, but that was it, right? And so if we can give that application security professional so much more information, reachability being the start of it, we'll save them a ton of time. And not only a ton of time, we will make a material impact on that security posture.
Honestly speaking, it will be a dream come true if I'm able to see, signals from CSPM for my enterprise application combined with results from, sensitive data scanner, secret scanner, or static code analysis, dynamic application security. If I can see that in context with my assets for that enterprise application, that definitely makes my life easy, because that's not the only application me or my teams are worried about. We literally have thousands of applications and nobody has time to sit down and do all that stuff manually. So you're absolutely right, Patrick. When we have this type of vulnerability correlation in context of, combining all the signals and looking at the reachability attack path as well as the exploitability factor, it definitely helps us to, prioritize our decision making around remediation, releases, and whatnot.
Absolutely. And we know that automated remediation is a bit of a panacea. It's always a goal. We know we're not there. This would really help us get closer. And it's not a promise. It's not that, the minute we get this kind of precision that we can do it, but it feels to me like we're on a continuum of, we need a lot more trust in our AppSec alerts than we have now. I think, this is a great start. It really is.
Absolutely. I just want to caution a little bit that some tools had attempted automated remediation, and because sometimes it would cause, regression. This is not something possible for everything, but yes, something that can have low regression impact. We can definitely experiment and see if this solves our low hanging fruit, so that we can focus on just those critical vulnerable risks.
Absolutely. Everyone with a significant lab estate experiments with auto remediation. That's why we know we're not there yet, right? But like you say, there's a class of problem, and we face this in the cloud security world too. And I think we're probably there now in terms of there's a class of problem, kind of an A/B kind of configuration. If it's wrong, it has to be the other. That we can now begin to think about, fixing in an automated way, and that certainly is always the goal. Okay, so we talked about reachability. What that means at a high level. We're going to look at some examples in a moment, but let's then look at a concept that we need to understand reachability for, and that's VEX. VEX is a new standard, an emerging standard for disclosing information about applications, vulnerability information, but more than that, going a little bit above vulnerability information, risk information, right? Is that vulnerability exploitable? That's something that not traditionally, quite modernly actually, that we're talking about requires reachability analysis. And as Trupti said, that's a manual process. But with this emerging VEX standard, maybe the last mile of that analysis can be done by the application author, right? Can say in some sort of standard way, hey, yes, this is an application that has a CV associated with it, but it isn't vulnerable, and here's the reason. Right, that's the idea, is to disclose much more information, much more context about the application, as you see on the screen, in a machine readable way, such that we can use this format in automated processes and with our tools. But it's a huge leap forward, and I'm really curious on what kind of difference it's made for application developers, Trupti.
Yeah, as you say, vulnerability exploitability exchange provide us a automated way to check if a particular vulnerable function method is also reachable for the exploit. And that's where the game changer is, Patrick. We can do all this in a very scalable fashion because this mechanism actually exists. The concept of VEX was not that old. it became into light in 2021 when CISA started pushing for VEX. Because without this, all we would do is end up with gazillion vulnerability. Any enterprise organization at any given time would at least have 500,000 dependencies or open source component. And you can just imagine how overwhelming it is for them to see how many outdated packages they have, because how many vulnerabilities are there. Now, what VEX does is, once VEX is inserted along with your software composition analysis, it can actually tell us, hey, take a look at these top 5%, because we see this vulnerable function is actually used by the host application or system, and there is a public exploit available. So I think VEX is the way to go in the future. And when external reachability is combined with this internal reachability established by VEX, that's what gives application developers a clear signal. Okay, this is something risky. I need to act on it today, rather than, traditional SCA output.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's talk a little bit about how that works, what the standard looks like. This is probably the least interesting screen in the whole webinar, but important, right? Because there's a standard. I guess that's the point of this slide, is there's a standard for commuting all sorts of the information in the VEX standard, right? And the standard is it's JSON formatted, but the idea is, there's some information we expect in there: the author of the app, the timestamp. Obviously, applications evolve, so too do the information about applications, right? So these VEX documents will be living and breathing. They will evolve. So we need a way to understand what the most recent version is. So there's a lot of that sort of mechanism in the document. But I think the most important part is, the tie to the CVE standard, and more than that, the representation of risk. Right, we talked about the differentiation of vulnerability, and you just said it. There will be, in an application estate, there will be tens of thousands, if not more, vulnerabilities. So how do we know? How do we know which applications leverage those? How deeply they leverage them? This part of the VEX standard really goes a long ways in terms of telling us that, right? Because what'll happen quite often, and we haven't really given this example, we will very shortly in a hands-on example, but an SCA tool will say, hey, I see that you imported a library. But the analysis will sort of stop there, right? There's two things that could be done. One, you could look for the VEX document for it. Two, you could trace your code execution to understand exactly how you use that, right? And when you combine both of those together, boy, as you said, Trupti, boy, the internal versus external, boy, do you have a powerful way to say, out of all of this sea of vulnerability information, here's what you have to focus on. And that's exactly you said it, it's exactly what's needed. Maybe we could have got away without this approach in the big, I have 5 apps that change once a year kind of thing, but that's none of us, literally none of us anymore.
Yeah, we don't live in that era anymore.
Yeah.
We are in the era
Cloud or
of
not.
continuous design, deployment, integration, and developers make thousands of changes, and it's very difficult to stop their velocity by introducing these artificial security gates. It doesn't happen like that. So what VEX really allows us, it can tell developers without even need of any security engineers, do you need to worry about this CVA? It is affected or not affected. So yeah, that's the beauty. And currently the industry is exploring VEX concept for SBOMs and software composition analysis, but the very concept we can use for internal vulnerabilities that arise from static code analysis, dynamic application security testing, or manual pen test and threat modeling activities. So it's no different. We just need to, focus on internal VEX, just the way we focus on external VEX supplied by this standard. And we can further reduce the avalanche of alert if we have that functionality incorporated as part of our secure SDLC.
Absolutely. And really, combining both sources of information ensures the most thorough and practical assessment of that vulnerability risk available, right? That measures both proprietary code paths and external knowledge about specific risk and the remediation path, right? Because it's not just about the VEX standard, also has a little bit of a capability there too. So what we're trying to do is get that rebuild that trust in the alert stack. Get that false positive mountain of false positives under control, and not even false positive. A lot of the times it's not false positives. It's just way too much information. You're telling me vulnerabilities. I need risk. That's really, I mean, if you had to summarize it, that's what it is. Application security teams they're tired of the noise that I think SCA and SAS methods create, and it's not their fault. The reason that happens is that they're done in isolation of everything else, right? And that is literally the goal of ASPM. And reachability and VEX are probably, two of the strongest signals. Maybe I'd throw in some level of infrastructure knowledge because I think that's missing in appSec as well, right? But they are. I mean, they will help us rebuild trust in that alert stack if we do it right, for sure.
Correct. And Patrick, I also see that with the emergence of ASPM, where ASPM includes reachability and VEX analysis, what is going to happen is the way SAS would report findings in isolation or DAST or SCA tool. Now we are going to see, non-critical vulnerability as well. Like this particular ASPM mechanism is going to provide us avenues to see, okay, I have this 3 low-level vulnerabilities reported by SAS related to this assets and 4 medium security vulnerability reported by SCA. What's the total context?
Right.
So as an application security engineer, in my earlier career days, like 15 years back, I would comfortably ignore low severity vulnerabilities because they wouldn't matter that much. But with the power of ASPM, I will able to take a look at vulnerabilities related to a particular asset and holistically based on reachability and VEX, which ones matter and which ones not.
Yeah.
Many times what happens, 3 low-level vulnerabilities reported by 3 different scanners. Contextually, when put together, this could be a medium or even high, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, risk is not a CVSS score. It's an important piece. If we talk about signals, it's a signal, but it's only one. And so for so long, we've just taken it as the gospel truth, if you will, right? The only signal, and it should probably be the least of the ones we really sort of understand. So yeah, absolutely. So okay, example time. Let's talk about, and we're going to get actually into code. I mean, we're talking about reachability and VEX. That makes sense, but we'll keep the examples very, very simple. Obviously, we have more than just a developer audience here, me included. So let's walk through this. If we have an application that imports a library, as you can see in the second line of that little code snippet there, right? Imports a vulnerable library, and then you see the rest of the application. It doesn't actually use it. It doesn't really matter what's in the library. You can see in that first code snippet, right? It does something relatively trivial and ends. So very simple example. You might say, well, that would never actually happen in the wild, and you'd be right. Not to that elementary extreme example, but absolutely when you think about a continually evolving estate of applications, a continually evolving set of people and skill sets, libraries do get imported and maybe used at one time, but maybe not in the future. As you suggest, not suggest, as you say, Trupti, that applications evolve quicker than ever, right? And so this does happen, this idea of a orphaned library, and just the importation of it is enough in many sort of SCA methods to say, oh, you've got something vulnerable, here's a high severity alert, right? I know a very basic example, but that's kind of where we start.
Yeah, this is a very normal scenario, in the world of development. We have so many dependencies and we import them. But many times when we go through SCA results, we find a lot of these are not actually used by the host applications. I agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to look at the next example where even if they're used, we need to know a little bit more, right? Let's say that this wasn't an orphan and there was a library imported and I used it. I still need to know a little bit more. And that's what our next example talks about. So let's do the same thing. I've got an app imports a library with a known vulnerability. Let's call it something we think there's a vulnerability in. And we actually use a method in that library. Okay, so now this is the scary case where we've hit 2 signals. We've used it, and it's vulnerable. VEX helps us understand it actually isn't vulnerable. it may look vulnerable. Maybe this is a high profile open source library or application. I mean, we've seen many over the last few years, right? Log4j is the one that comes to mind, but there's many. A simple pattern match isn't enough. Now we can read the VEX document associated with that application. They can say, actually, in this version, it's not affected. And there's lots of reasons for that possibility, right? We could have an application author include components in an application for backwards compatibility that the code actually doesn't use, but it's there for compatibility for versions behind. Where they can say, look, the exploitability of this in this application as shipped isn't affected. That's something that my platform or I can take as a super key signal, right? For me to say, I've used I can see via my code trace that I've used this a very vulnerable library, but turns out thanks to VEX, it actually isn't.
Yes, who knows? Maybe for this particular library version, the backported patch is already available. So yeah, and CVE takes time to get updated and whatnot. So I agree with you, Patrick, that VEX is going to make everybody's life super easy.
Yeah, and when we take that idea of reachability, combine it with internal and external kind of reachability in VEX, what a powerful combination for sure.
Yes.
Okay. So we're just about at our end. We're going to take a look at the Q&A panel here. We do have a few questions, so we will save some time, but I wanted to give you, Trupti, just a few minutes for any sort of closing thoughts or ideas. As we think about ASPM, we know there are different approaches to it. If you're looking for an ASPM solution, there are vendors who are thinking about signal aggregation from other vendors, basically master aggregators of signals from popular vendors. There are other vendors like Backslash who think doing the signal detection ourselves and natively give us much more of an overall idea of that threat model, right? You can do a lot more when you're the one detecting the signals versus if you're aggregating others. I think that's kind of our perspective. So, I'm interested in your thoughts of how this area will emerge, and how much reachability will help in the long term.
Yeah, as you said, there are certain vendors who focuses on vulnerability aggregation, and instead of showing somebody, hundreds and thousands of vulnerability, they are still going to show thousands of vulnerabilities. Does these vulnerabilities mean actual risk? We don't know, because unfortunately, aggregation doesn't do that. Aggregation uses tagging and combine signals from multiple sources and provide us, hey, this is a unified view. Does that help me really to do risk analysis? I still have to sit down with the architecture diagram, design, look at my assets, look at my crown jewels, where is the path. These particular set of vulnerabilities can be exploitable either by malicious insider or by an external state actor. So I think the second category of ASPM that you mentioned kind of provides developers as well as application security engineers one-stop shop, like a view of how does the architecture of the affected enterprise application look like.
Yep.
Where are the existing security controls, where is the data, and how is the path, along with the vulnerability information. So I think the second approach will go a long way, because this is going to save developers as well as security engineer a lot of time. Like, we literally do this analysis on whiteboard, and this is the precise information VP of engineering and directors of engineering are interested before making that release decision of go, no go. Many times vulnerabilities take a lot of days or sometimes even months combining the regression testing to fix it. And it's not always possible. So having this type of intelligent information that, look, actually this is not reachable, because we have these two security controls in place. So it's okay to sit with that vulnerability for 1 or 2 more weeks, and we can fix it in the next release. That's perfectly acceptable. So I think that's what the second category of ASPM will provide that picture to empower people like me.
It's so well put. And I wonder, as you talk about that, what comes to mind is the gap between application developers and security professionals. And it seems to be widening. in some cases, and maybe that's because, you know, you have this stack of, you know, 5,000 high severity alerts. A security professional doesn't have the skill set. They have to lean on that application developer to say, hey, chase this down for me. This looks bad. And to your point, 5% of what looks bad is actually really bad. I mean, that doesn't make for a great relationship when someone's always asking you to verify that this is, you know, this is important, when, you know, 5% of the time you do that, it actually is. If we can, if you know, we can build a platform that has enough of these signals that, and obviously the other part is an algorithm that understands the right weight and, you know, what is important and what isn't. It's not just the throw all the signals on a whiteboard and you know, hope they give you a lot of information. To your point, there's some intelligence here, but, you know, if a platform can do that weighing, that prioritization in a real intelligent way, I can imagine maybe that we can help shorten that chasm maybe that's developing, because I hear about it a lot. You know, I hear about how difficult it is, and it's even worse when application folks are the security professionals. I mean, that doesn't quite happen in super large enterprises, but in the mid-market it does, and I think that level of frustration is even worse.
Yes, and you know, whatever you said, that is the precise reason why there is friction between developers and the security engineering teams. You know, in industry, the general ratio is behind every 100 developer, there is one security engineer. What that means is this particular security engineer is responsible for managing multiple tools. This person may be responsible for managing at least 20 plus application at given time. And as a result, they do not necessarily have the deep context a developer has. A developer works on maybe one or two components of a, you know, a large feature or a service. So they go really deep, right? This is what they do day in, day out. And if we look at, you know, developers' bread and butter is the shiny new features that they push that generates revenue, not bug fixes. All the bugs, whether security bugs or quality bugs, they become part of the technical depth, and they rely on prioritization done by engineering managers to knock them down. So if, you know, these are the two different focus areas for these two personas, right?
Yes.
This is exactly where, you know, ASPM can help. Once they show them visually, you know, where is the reachability, which risk to focus on, then it can save them a lot of time in decision making. The analysis time reduces from weeks to probably few hours, because the information is right in front of your eyes in the form of high fidelity signals.
Perfect. We have a question. Let's pop into them. I think we have just a few minutes left here. I have a handful, but here's one that just popped up. Let's answer this one. How did, or let's change that to can, because I'm not sure it did. How can integrating ASPM and custom signal handling together? I guess that, you know, that's one part and parcel together in a financials institution web application enhance security, specifically in mitigating DDoS attacks and data breaches. DDoS attacks are a little more in front of the application. I mean, I'm going to let the professional here answer this question, right? But data breaches, we probably have a lot more to talk about there. What's your perspective there, Trupti?
Yeah, as you said, you know, Patrick, distributed denial of service attack. This is a different type of attack. It usually happens on the infrastructure itself. And today's modern cloud application, they rely on exclusive DDoS protections. Now, if we look slightly into application security realm, WAF, web application firewall, could be a way to go. And as you know, ASPM is still emerging new term in the industry, application security posture management. So different vendors are using ASPM term differently. But I'm going to focus on now on this question. When the ASPM, the second interpretation of ASPM that you and I just now talked about, when we combine this with signal from WAFs, which is web application security firewall, we will able to make those intelligent decision. Let's say we are seeing this increase in cloud traffic for these particular APIs, and ASPM will able to tell, hey, whether there is a vulnerable SQL injection or cross-site scripting or any type of code level vulnerability exists, and this can help the application security engineer to fine tune the WAF. Oh yes, that really exists. Let me act quickly. Let me fine tune the WAF so that developers will get enough time to do the code level fix. So that's the beauty here we are talking about. Now we are no longer looking at different signal in isolation, but we have this powerful ASPM, which is going to give us how bad the issue is or how good we are. Let's say we are seeing a lot of DOS traffic around some API, but there is no vulnerability. Then we are going to comfortably and confidently tell our upper management that, what, the code level vulnerability doesn't exist. This is something the perimeter firewall will knock down. We don't have to worry.
I love that different areas of focus, different levels of confidence, but having confidence that you understand, your situational awareness across all of those pillars. It's so true, and without ASPM, typically the WAF is it's a bit of a gray area. Is it infrastructure? Yes. Is it often out of developers' purview for configuration? Yes. Yet it's intimately tied to an application, right? And so without an ASPM approach, those signals could easily be missed for sure. But in at least in the holistic idea, like you say, the second version of what we talked about, that ASPM approach, we have the ability to say that's an infrastructure signal, but we need it here on the application security side. We absolutely do.
Correct.
So that's I think how you answer that question for sure.
Yeah, and if we focus on the second half of the question, which is data breaches, what ASPMs are going to tell us is this is where my crown jewels is, and these are the hoops somebody has to cross in order to reach to this particular crown jewel or asset, right?
Right.
So I don't think so. There are a lot of tools out there that can show the complete attack path or the toxic flow. So that's what ASPM will help. It will give sufficient information to application security engineers to quickly take that decision. If they don't see that reachability, that means we still have a lot of time to figure out things. But if there is a clear reachability, then act fast. So I think if we combine ASPM with a bunch of other custom signals, it's going to give us holistic and faster way to detect and respond to these type of situations.
Yeah, I agree. Respond to what's really most important, truly most important, right? Because we've looked at a breadth of information and we're confident that it is. Yeah, completely agree. Okay, well, I think we probably have time for at least one more. Can you provide an example of a concealed risk that might be overlooked without the use of reachability analysis? Any ideas there?
Yeah, I can think about, a plain simple secret scanner that simply uses regex functionality to look for sensitive information leaked. And many times what happens is this type of information is leaked in internal logs or configuration files, which are not necessarily externally reachable,
right,
but could be internally reachable if somebody has the almighty internal access. So this is where the reachability analysis becomes really, really important. Let's say you have gazillion alerts showing some secrets leakage, but there is no way to reach. You may not want to, of course, you want to fix that vulnerability, but it may not be like drop everything and fix it.
of course.
So yeah, reachability analysis is extremely important.
I love it. Okay, let's do one more. This one's kind of open-ended, so it should be a fun way to conclude. Can you elaborate on the roadmap to prioritizing with assurance? What steps should organizations take to achieve this level of confidence in their risk prioritization? I mean, this is a good summary question because it kind of wraps up a lot of things. Okay, so what's the maturity model to get to prioritizing with assurance? If we think about, okay, today, day one, I have 6 application security tools. They all give me different output. I'm spending way too much time. What are some low-hanging fruit? What are some things I can do?
Yeah. So first of all, we want to find out, is this something exploitable in production versus dev? So we want to determine what is the target environment here where the vulnerability can be exploitable. So that's a good signal or prioritization criteria to focus on. Second criteria is always the reachability analysis. Is this something reachable or not reachable? If things are reachable, with an active exploit, then yes, go fix it, right? Third and very non-traditional way, like I haven't seen many experts talking about this, is what's the cost of remediation? Because many times security engineers are not into the weeds. They do not understand how long it takes for developers to actually write the fix and then test it out, and without causing any regression, roll it out. So that is also a very important prioritization criteria we all have to keep in mind. And this is not something just devs or security can decide in isolation. They have to come together in a room. So I would
so
say,
smart, actually, right? To think about the cost of remediation. Does it outweigh the cost of the risk? I mean, if everything's high severity and we can't differentiate, we have no idea. But if we get to that point where we could start to think that way.
and it's not just whether the cost of remediation exceeding the cost of the risk. It's mainly around, is this even feasible? Because many times, there are legacy environments, and many times we see a mix of legacy architecture plus the modern architecture coexist at the same time. So it's not super easy to just make that architecture or design level change. And this is where, developers need help from security engineers to have secondary controls, detective controls in place. That's why.
Absolutely. I think with that, that's a perfect place to end. Thank you so much, Trupti. There's a lot that we didn't unpack. We alluded to some things. I would love to collaborate with you again. We could talk about, now that we have all these signals, yes, we can do great risk prioritization. We can do other things too. We can visualize data. We can show you things in ways that you've never seen before, in terms of threat models and how to think about what's exploitable and what isn't. Lots of good fodder for another session, but thank you so much for your time. I hope it was valuable, and I hope it was valuable for everyone that attended.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you very much, audience, for brilliant questions.
Thanks, everybody. This recording or this webinar has been recorded, will be available post-event. We'll be in touch with everybody after the event. Thank you so much.